button. Good morning, everyone. So today I have the great pleasure to introduce here Anthony Fernandez. He's going to talk about approaches to psychiatric classification, operationalism, and phenomenology. This presentation is always within the California State University, the Department of Philosophy and Studies, the cycle of SEM. Yeah, welcome, Anthony. I'm very happy you are here today, and the floor is all yours.
Oh, thanks so much for the invitation. Let me see if I can get the slides up for you. So I'm trying, okay. Does that work? Can you see my slides just fine? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks again for the invitation. I think what I'm going to do here is run you through something that's fairly introductory, giving you an overview of what we'll consider to be the dominant view, the dominant approach within psychiatric classification and diagnosis today, which is called operationalism. And that's the approach that's used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's primarily from the US, but is also used internationally. So I'm going to run you through some of the basics of operationalism as an approach within psychiatry. And then as I'm running you through this, there will also be some kind of implicit critiques of this approach that come up. And then by the end, I'll have a brief section where I discuss phenomenology, which is a philosophical tradition concerned with the study of experience and subjectivity. And many phenomenologists also work in this overlapping area between phenomenology and psychiatry. And many of them have been quite critical of the specific approach within psychiatric classification and diagnosis called operationalism. And they've developed a series of critiques and have proposed alternatives. So I'll briefly sketch kind of what that alternative vision looks like at the end of the presentation. Okay, so we'll start with a brief history of the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So again, the manual is published by the American Psychiatric Association, which is the professional body of psychiatrists in the US. And while it is the dominant manual, the main manual that's used in the US, again, it's widely influential internationally. And although many other countries would use the International Classification of Diseases rather than the DSM, they're largely developed in parallel. So often when changes happen in the DSM or in the ICD, they'll also occur a few years later in the others. So they try to keep them roughly parallel. So there's also that facilitates international collaboration and so on. But some specific aspects of what I'm describing here as operationalism applies only to the DSM. But again, some people outside of the US will also use the DSM when conducting diagnoses, even if in the end they have to use a code from the International Classification of Diseases. Now, the current edition that we use is actually the DSM-5 TR. And I think on average, a new edition of the DSM comes out probably around every 15 years or so, although they don't have a regular schedule of when they release a new one. But in between the release of a full new edition, they often release some kind of revision. If it's called TR, that just means text revised. So in the case of the DSM-5, it initially came out in 2013. The text revised version just came out earlier this year. And essentially that means that there's no substantial changes, but there is some change to how they describe some of the conditions and how they might have organized some sections of the manual. Other editions have had, fairly major revisions about halfway through before they publish the next edition, but for the most part, really substantial changes in how we categorize or understand certain disorders tend to only occur when we have a full new edition. Now, we rarely talk about the DSM before the DSM-3. The DSM-3 came out in 1980, and this is where we introduce this operational approach. So a lot of what you can say about the way that the third edition works from 1980 largely holds for even how the 5th edition text revised works today. So while there's been some modification in how exactly which categories we draw and which symptoms we use in order to diagnose those categories, the general approach that I'm going to describe here is one that's existed since 1980 at least, all the way up to today, and doesn't seem like something that's going to change too quickly, although there's kind of constant criticism of it. So what's so special about the DSM-3, right? What changed in this case from what we saw in the DSM-1 and 2? And the really simple answer here is just to say psychiatrists adopted this approach called operationalism, and I'll of course have to explain what that is to you. But one thing to keep in mind here is that what psychiatrists call operationalism actually differs quite a bit from how it's been used in other sciences. It's actually an approach originally developed in physics, and the way psychiatrists use it is kind of quite watered down compared to the way physicists might use this approach. So the more complicated answer is to say, well, prior to the DSM-3, when we had the DSM-1, the DSM-2, these were in many respects kind of broadly psychoanalytic or psychodynamic in orientation, and they didn't use very specific symptom criteria for diagnosis. So often what you'd be presented with in, say, the DSM-2, for instance, is kind of a brief vignette. So you'd have kind of a 1-paragraph description of a disorder, and that description would include some symptoms, although it might not give you a clear sense of kind of which symptoms are most important or most common, but a kind of some sense of the basic symptoms. But it might also include some descriptions of the kind of psychological or psychodynamic causes of the disorder as well. So it wasn't purely descriptive, because they were already bought into the idea that we can have these kind of psychoanalytic or psychodynamic explanations of disorders. So the manual was both descriptive and to some degree explanatory. And if you didn't share that same basic foundation, like a psychoanalytic foundation, some of the causal accounts might not make much sense to you, or ones that you might ignore. But the main issue actually that pushed the move from the DSM to the DSM-2 to DSM-3 is not so much that it was psychoanalytic, but that it had what's called low interrated reliability. So the simple way of describing this is to say, interrated reliability basically refers to how likely it is that 2 or more psychiatrists are going to diagnose the same patient with the same disorder. So in the case of the DSM-2, because it didn't have particularly clear symptoms that you were looking for, right? It gave you a brief description of the disorder. There were some symptoms in there, but it wasn't clear how many symptoms they had to present or how long you had to present those symptoms for and so on. That meant that it was quite easy for psychiatrists to disagree about how to diagnose a patient. So once this became wider public knowledge, there was a scientific crisis within psychiatry, right? People found that psychiatry didn't seem to be living up to what we expect to be the standards of medicine. So we, of course, always acknowledge that even when getting a diagnosis of a somatic disorder, you might seek a second opinion. There are cases where experts can disagree, but you typically don't have anything like what we had prior to DSM-3, where there was a huge amount of disagreements among psychiatrists over who had which disorders and how they should be diagnosed. So during the time that we had the DSM-2, starting in the late 1950s and the 1970s, there's this group of researchers at Washington University, St. Louis, and their goal was to develop a medical model of psychiatric disorders, right? Because what we have in the DSM-2 isn't truly a medical model, it's some kind of psychoanalytic or psychodynamic model. They wanted what they considered to be a medical model, the same kind of model we would use when diagnosing and categorizing and classifying somatic conditions. So as part of this research, in 1972, they published a paper, and what they present in this paper is today known as the Feigner Criteria. This is not what they called it, but the first author's name on the paper is Feigner, so this name stuck. And essentially what they present in this 1972 paper is an outline of a series of categories of disorder. I think they had something like 14 categories they had already had in the paper itself. And for each category, they included a list of kind of core symptoms that need to be met, or at least some subset of those symptoms need to be met in order for someone to be diagnosed with this category of disorder. Now, the criteria they developed here, and also the categories of disorder they developed here, became the basis for how the DSM-3 was developed. And again, the DSM-3 was published then 8 years later in 1980. So the DSM-3 is, of course, much, much larger than this one article by this Feigner group. But essentially, it still followed the same model where for each category of disorder, it would list a set of symptoms, and some subset of those symptoms had to be met for a certain period of time. And if it met those criteria, then you're supposed to diagnose the patient with that particular category of disorder. Right? So it seemed like a much more systematic way to go about the process of psychiatric diagnosis than what we were doing prior to the DSM-3 and the Feigner Criteria. Now, this approach is what we call operationalism, at least within psychiatry. Again, if you look up operationalism and you look at how it's used across different sciences or how it's historically been used, you'll find that what psychiatrists mean by this is kind of unique, because it often has a reference to specific forms of kind of measurement practices, which is not really what we're doing in psychiatry. But this is still the approach, like I said, that we have in DSM-3 starting in 1980, and it's very much the approach that's still being used today in the latest version of the DSM-5. But essentially how operationalism works within psychiatry is, again, that each category of disorder will include a symptom checklist, and the number of symptoms varies from disorder to disorder. But typically there's a list of symptoms, and then it will tell you how many of these symptoms have to be present in the patient and for what duration they have to be present. Typically, they'll have to be present for that same duration. And if the patient presents the set number of symptoms for the set duration, then you're supposed to diagnose them with this particular disorder. Now, one of the benefits of this approach is that we end up with higher interrated reliability, right? So it's now much easier for psychiatrists to agree about how to diagnose a patient in front of them. Because before you would have two psychiatrists who would both read through kind of the same one-paragraph vignette with some general sense of the typical symptoms and so on. And they might disagree about how many of those symptoms should be present and for how long and so on. But in this case, it tells you exactly, for instance, there might be 5 symptoms and the patient has to present 3 of them, and they have to present all 3 of them for at least a month. And if that's the case, then both psychiatrists are working with the same exact set of criteria. And there is still room for disagreement at various points in time. You might disagree about whether a patient really does present that symptom or really has presented that symptom for a certain duration. But for the most part, there's quite a bit of agreement among psychiatrists now because of the operational approach. Now, if you look at critiques of contemporary psychiatry and the system of classification and diagnosis, you no longer really see these major critiques of reliability like we used to see prior to the 1980s. But what you see now are critiques about validity, and that can mean lots of different things. But for the most part, the main concern now is that we're still failing to identify any clear neurobiological causes of the disorders. But first, let's go through an example. So I'll just show you what this kind of criteria looks like and how it's used. So in the case of major depressive disorder, and this is a page from the DSM-5, in this first section, in section A, it says that the patient needs to have or present 5 or more of the following symptoms, and they have to present them over the same 2-week period. Now, there are 9 symptoms listed there. It also specifies that the patient has to present at least item 1 or item 2 among those 5 that they present. Now, it seems like this is fairly systematic. It seems like it's a good way to go about diagnosing, but let me just run you through an example to show some of the ways in which this begins to become problematic fairly quickly. In this case, if you need to have symptom 1 or symptom 2, let's say you have 2 different patients. One of them has symptom 1, which is depressed mood, and then let's say they also have symptoms 3, 4, 5, and 6. So they therefore have 5 symptoms, and they've had them for over 2 weeks. So they meet the criteria for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Suppose that your other patients, they don't present symptom 1, but they do present symptom 2, and then they have symptoms 6, 7, 8, and 9. So they also present 5 symptoms for a 2-week period. In this case, you would diagnose both patients with major depressive disorder, but they would actually share only one symptom, right? They'd only share, in this case, symptom 6. which is fatigue or loss of energy, which seems to be also not a particularly kind of core symptom to depression, right? There's lots of conditions that involve fatigue or loss of energy. But we're already beginning to see the kind of heterogeneity that you might find here because of the way that we set this up. This is called also a polytheic approach, which means that you have multiple symptoms among the criteria, and you only have to meet some subset of those symptoms, not all of them. And this becomes even more complicated once we look, for instance, at symptoms 3, 4, and 5, because those seem to be symptoms that we might actually want to call 2 different symptoms instead of 1. So, right, symptom 3 is significant weight loss or weight gain. It seems like we might want to separate those and say weight loss is one symptom, weight gain is another symptom. The next one is insomnia and hypersomnia. Again, things that we typically wouldn't want to categorize as a single symptom. And once we start dividing these up, it actually very easily becomes possible that 2 people would be diagnosed with major depressive disorder without sharing a single symptom. Now, this wouldn't be problematic if we knew that there was a very clear, say, neurobiological cause for major depressive disorder, and we could reliably identify this cause. And we also knew that just because of other factors, maybe other kinds of environmental factors, how exactly that cause ends up being presented in the patient's behavior and experience and so on, maybe that's quite diverse or heterogeneous. So it may very well be possible that 2 people have the same underlying neurobiological condition, but present it in 2 completely different ways. But that's not the case here because, as with nearly every psychiatric disorder, we haven't identified a clear cause. So because we haven't identified a clear cause, we only really understand major depressive disorder. We only kind of can identify it by using these diagnostic criteria. But we've set them up in such a way that they're so heterogeneous that we can, in fact, again, diagnose 2 or more people with major depressive disorder without really sharing a single symptom. And now it's unclear that we're really identifying a single disorder, right? It may be worth backing up here and saying, well, it looks like maybe what we have are multiple disorders, and we just have far too broad of a category. So yes, psychiatrists can all agree when a patient walks into a room and meets the criteria for major depressive disorder. But now there's another question of, are they really getting at the same thing? Just because they can agree, it doesn't mean that we're actually identifying the same thing out there in the world. So there are lots of different ways to articulate the general concern here, and a lot of different directions to go. I'm just going to focus on one issue, which just gets a little bit deeper into what operationalism is. And this is to focus on the question of what it means to index something. So this quote is from an article by Kenneth Kendler, who's a psychiatrist who does a lot of theoretical work, conceptual work. And he asks the question, how should DSM criteria relate to the disorders they are designed to assess? I suggest that US psychiatry as a field has tended to reify DSM criteria. This approach reflects a conceptual error, a category mistake. This mistake is taking an index of a thing for the thing itself. And I would prefer to slightly reword that last sentence, and rather than saying it's taking an index of a thing for the thing itself, say that it's taking an index of a thing for a definition of the thing. So I don't think people are, for instance, taking that list of symptom criteria for major depressive disorder and thinking it is major depressive disorder, but they are looking at it as if it's supposed to provide some kind of definition of major depressive disorder. And in fact, that's not what it's providing. What it is in fact providing is an index. And I'll run you through a kind of philosophical example or thought experiment in a moment to highlight what we mean by an index here, what an index is and can be. But the main concern is that, and in fact, there's some ambiguity here because I think it was in the DSM-3 actually, that in the introduction, they actually said that what they were providing were definitions of disorders. And I believe that's fallen out of the introductions now. So I think if you look at introductions to the latest editions of the DSM, they no longer say that they're defining disorders. What they're doing is helping you identify disorders. And that's something that's quite different. But it's a bit dangerous to even think that at some point they thought that what they were doing was in fact defining disorders. So to explain what we mean by an index, I mean, I think in kind of everyday speech, the most common case in which we use the word index, at least in academia, is referring to, for instance, the index in the back of a book. right? And what the index in the back of the book does is it helps you identify where something is, right? It's a way of pointing towards something. So an index is often some kind of tool that points you towards something or helps you pick something out, decide whether or not something is or is not the thing that you're looking for. And there's a variety of ways in which they can work, but I'll give you an example here to highlight how an index differs from a definition, and also to show you what some of the problems are that you might run into if you use an index instead of a definition. So let us use the example of indexing a stop sign. So that's something much simpler than trying to index, for instance, a psychiatric disorder. So suppose that you have a company where you conduct surveys for small towns to help them with their traffic problems, right? So if they have too much congestion or something, they might call you up and ask you to do a survey of their town. And what you do is you take a look at where all of their traffic signs are and what kind of traffic lights they have and the way they built their roads and everything. And you give them some kind of recommendation about what they should change in order to help with the traffic issues. So one thing you have to do for this work is you have to figure out where they have all of their stop signs, right? How many stop signs the town has and where those stop signs are placed. But suppose that, let's say because of COVID, you're not able to travel right now. So you need to find someone who lives in this town to do the work for you. And here's the weird kind of philosophical thought experiment part. Assume that the only person you can find to do the work is someone who has no idea what traffic signs are, right? It's maybe someone who's never driven. They've just been living in their house, not coming outside for decades or 100 years at this point, maybe, if they still have no idea what traffic laws are or anything. This is the only person who's kind of volunteered to do the work for you. So you need to find a way to explain to them how they should go about reliably identifying stop signs and telling you where the stop signs are. But you don't want to take the time to introduce them to the nature of kind of traffic and traffic laws and the different kinds of traffic signs they might see. Instead, you just want to give them the simplest possible way to walk around the town, just walk down all the streets and reliably identify all of the stop signs for you and mark them on a map. So rather than trying to come up with some kind of holistic definition of a stop sign to give them, you just come up with an index. You just say, look, I want you to walk around the town and I want you to identify anything that is red, octagonal, and says stop. And anytime you find an item that meets those three criteria, I want you to mark that on the map and just tally it up so you can tell me how many stop signs there are and where exactly they are. And that's all I need you to do. You don't even need to know what it is that you're really looking for. If it meets these criteria, you mark it, right? So this is an index that you've just provided to this volunteer. So suppose that he walks around the whole town, he marks all the stop signs on the map and he sends you the map. And you look at it, and for the most part, it looks fairly accurate, right? You find the stop signs at intersections where you expect them to be. They're on the corners of roads. But maybe there's this one spot right next to the school where you see a bunch of stop signs marked in a row all down the street and around the corner and down the next street. And it seems like this is a very weird way to organize stop signs in a town. And eventually you realize that what happened is that your volunteer actually marked all the stop signs on the sides of the school buses that were in front of the school. So there's a sense in which this is a stop sign, right? It meets the indexing criteria that you gave him. But if you had asked someone who just knew what stop signs were, who had some kind of working definition of a stop sign, they never would have marked these down because they know that's not what you're looking for, right? They're not actual stop signs. They're things that look like stop signs and get to be used roughly in the way stop signs are used, but only in a particular context. They're not the same thing as a stop sign at an intersection. So there's different things you could do here to fix this, right? You could decide that you're going to actually give this guy a working definition of stop signs so he can really understand what they are. But maybe the simplest fix is instead to just fix the index, which I think is the typical response in psychiatry. It's if our index didn't work properly, then just come up with a new index or modify it in some way. So maybe we can just do something like this. We just add another criterion and we just say it also has to be on a pole. So now that cuts out all of these stop signs and just leaves us, ideally, with the ones that are actually at the intersections, the ones we're really looking for. But there can, of course, still be issues here, right? It might be the case that some kids stole a stop sign and pulled one out of the ground and put it in their backyard. And if this guy sees that stop sign in their backyard, he'll mark it on the map as well. Or someone, took one and put it inside their house or something like that. So there's lots of different ways in which you can easily become confused if you're just operating with an index and you don't have a clear definition that's grounding that index, right? In this case, you, as the person who owns the surveying company, you know what a stop sign is, and you would be able to very reliably pick out the right ones as you're going around doing your work. But if you find someone who doesn't have the same background knowledge that you have, and they're using an index without the definition grounding it, then there's all kinds of issues you might run into. Now, if we're using this as an analogy for psychiatry, it's a little more complicated, of course, because psychiatrists do have a lot of specialist training and a lot of other expertise besides just what you can pick up and read in the DSM. So there's some sense in which they have some kind of understandings that are grounding these indices that they're using. But even when educated in psychiatry, you may very well not be provided with something like a very clear definition, for instance, of major depressive disorder. You may very well be taught what major depressive disorder is by being taught the common symptoms that you need to use in order to diagnose it. So of course, there's different training systems in different areas, different countries, and so on. So we'll be taught in different ways and receive different kinds of background knowledge. But there is still a sense in which, at least within this operational system in the US, there's a very heavy focus on teaching from the DSM, because this is the system that you're going to use when actually diagnosing patients in the clinic. So you have a lot of training and being able to use the DSM well. But this also means that there's maybe not something always grounding those indices that we have. So we, at this point, I think, have begun to see some of the issues with the way in which we use operationalism and the kind of approach that we've developed here in contemporary psychiatry, right? On the one hand, we have this operational approach that does increase reliability. It allows psychiatrists to more readily agree with each other about how to diagnose a patient. But at the same time, we end up with a situation where there's often a lot of heterogeneity because we end up drawing our categories far too broadly. We also end up in a situation where sometimes, depending on which indices you're using and what kind of background knowledge you actually have to support or back up those indices, you may very well, agree with the person sitting next to you that you should diagnose someone in this way, but that can still be an incorrect diagnosis. You could still be missing something important there if you're really just forefronting the index and not trying to arrive at some kind of deeper understanding of the condition that it is that you're trying to diagnose here. So there are lots of different kind of philosophical and theoretical critiques that have been presented to try to undermine this operational approach or correct it or modify it in some way. I'm just going to focus here on critiques that come from this philosophical tradition called phenomenology. So we can define phenomenology in a wide variety of ways. It's quite difficult to define because the philosophical tradition has taken many different forms. But for our purposes, we'll just define it as a philosophical approach to describing the structure of experience. So when we say that it's describing the structure of experience, a phenomenologist might be interested, for instance, in describing the way in which we experience the flow of time. They might be interested in describing different kinds of affective states, so distinguishing between what we mean by an emotion and what we mean by a mood. And when they do this kind of work, they're not typically interested in any particular person's experience. So if they're describing, for instance, what they mean by an emotion or what we should mean by an emotion, like what an emotion is, the phenomenologist won't be interested in describing what emotional state you find yourself in, as opposed to what emotional state I find myself in, right? Instead, they're interested in describing what do we mean by an emotion in the first place, and how does that apply in a kind of broad and general sense to any experiencing human being. So in this respect, it's very much a philosophical project. Now, on the other hand, we have another field within psychiatry called psychopathology. And this is a scientific approach to the study of mental disorders, and it can include both descriptive and explanatory approaches. So a psychopathologist who takes a more explanatory approach might primarily be concerned with identifying neurobiological causes of categories of disorder. But there are also psychopathologists who are trained phenomenologically, and they're primarily interested in experience. So they take a more descriptive approach for the most part. They might be interested in describing, for instance, what we mean by a delusion, or what a hallucination is, or what we mean by depressed mood. And they'll often want to describe these things in much more, with much more rigor and much more detail than what we would find in the DSM. So there is some sense in which the DSM indexing, like this, or the indices they provide for each category of disorder, there is a sense in which those are supposed to be grounded on certain kinds of definitions, but they're not definitions of the disorder itself. Instead, they're supposed to be definitions of the symptoms. So if you look at the DSM, for instance, and the category I gave you of major depressive disorder, one of the key criteria is depressed mood. And if you look then into the back of the DSM where they give definitions, they'll give some longer description of what they mean by a depressed mood. But you'll find that it's still a fairly superficial definition. It's the same thing if you look at the way in which the terms delusions and hallucinations are used in the DSM. They do provide definitions in the back of the book, but they're fairly superficial definitions, and it's pretty easy to show how they can't be right, or they shouldn't be the ones that we're using. So there's this field that develops already early in the 20th century with the work of Karl Jaspers around 1912, 1913, but it's still going on to today, called Phenomenological Psychopathology. And this field is primarily concerned with describing in a very rigorous and systematic way what these experiential alterations are like. So describing what the experience of delusion is actually like, what an experience of hallucination is actually like, what a depressed mood is, and so on. And phenomenologists tend to argue that we really need to start from this experiential standpoint, that even if our goal is to find some kind of neurobiological cause to disorders, we first have to know what experience it is that's being caused by this kind of neurobiological alteration. And in order to get at that, you have to have very clear descriptions of the experience, because there's lots of experiences and experiential alterations that might seem superficially similar. But in fact, if we get down to it and we start kind of inquiring more deeply into the experience, we'll find that there are, in fact, important differences that we need to describe and articulate. And these are differences that are typically going to be glossed in an operational approach, because an operational approach has to rely on whatever kind of easily observable signs and symptoms we can find. It doesn't really give you the space to inquire more deeply into the experience behind the symptoms there, or the experience that constitute the symptoms. So let's just briefly run through 3 critiques that phenomenologists or phenomenological psychopathologists have leveled against the operational approach. The first is they argue that it ignores how clinicians actually diagnose their patients, and phenomenologists tend to argue that clinicians have quite a bit of expertise, psychiatric or medical expertise that they use in order to, in many cases, intuitively diagnose patients. Now, they're not suggesting that this intuitive diagnosis is always the right diagnosis, or that one should never also appeal to some kind of systematic set of criteria, but they do tend to argue that psychiatrists often rely on some kind of intuitive approach to diagnosing. They just have a kind of a sense of what disorder someone has, and that really you should be able to incorporate that into the diagnostic process in some way. But currently, if you just use a kind of symptom checklist approach, then there's no space for talking about something like intuitive knowledge or the kind of expertise that gets used in using intuition to diagnose a patient. They also argue that, and this is maybe a more important critique, that the DSM neglects any kind of organization among the symptoms, right? It treats them atomistically, which is to say that they're just disparate symptoms. There's no accounts of why you would have all of these symptoms together or why they would occur at the same time. There's no real account of the priority of symptoms, but we get a little bit of that in that example of major depressive disorder, where it says that you have to have at least one of the 2 symptoms and the rest you can have any mix of those. But there's still not really a clear sense of why those symptoms are in fact, or hold some kind of priority over the others. So phenomenologists instead suggest that there really should be an approach in which we can identify how the symptoms are organized, right? Why they tend to occur together, how some might be compensatory mechanisms, right? They compensate for some other alteration. But they tend to think that treating symptoms atomistically as just some kind of set of criteria you have to look at, it doesn't actually help us get a sense of what the disorder is. And this is a critique that's leveled quite broadly. You see Kendler using this same kind of critique as well. But the phenomenologists also argue that the approach used in the DSM tends to allow categories to reify, so they don't change anymore. And in fact, this might not be a conflict or an argument against operationalism as a whole. It might just be an argument against the way in which operationalism has been used in the DSM. Because actually, if we look all the way back to the group that came up with the Feigner Criteria, they also published another paper where they specifically outlines the different approaches we're supposed to take in order to constantly refine and develop these categories and the symptoms that we use in order to diagnose these disorders. So they didn't just provide a set of categories with the specific symptoms and said, look, I think we got these right. This is just what we should use going forward. Instead, they had a whole system of further scientific research where you were supposed to continually question the categories, go back and do different kinds of research, and they actually give a kind of step-by-step guide about which kind of research you should do in which order, and in a sense you kind of loop around over and over and over again as you keep refining these categories. But what actually happened was that the categories were just kind of adopted as is into the DSM-3, and many of them today remain almost the same as what they were when they got adopted in 1980. But phenomenologists tend to argue for a kind of loosening of these categories so we can begin to question them and hopefully revise them. So they do present a kind of alternative. One thing to keep in mind here is that there is no competing phenomenological manual for classification or diagnosis. We don't have anything like that. But there are at least some suggestions in some of this literature about what such an approach should look like, or at least what role phenomenology should play in an alternative approach to classification. So they do suggest that we should at least acknowledge the role that expert intuition and judgment play in diagnosis, right? And they're not by no means suggesting that we should develop an approach in which psychiatrists can rely exclusively on their own expert intuition and judgment. They may very well need some kind of symptom criteria to supplement their own judgment. But the argument here again is that if you completely ignore the fact that psychiatrists are using this, then there's no way for them to even kind of reflect upon it or refer to it as something they used when coming to a conclusion. So they tend to think that the best approach is to acknowledge how it is that psychiatrists are actually going to interact with patients and understand patients in the clinical encounter, and then find ways to harness what it is that psychiatrists are naturally going to do in these encounters and integrate that into a diagnostic procedure. They also argue that we should identify some kind of core gestalt or some kind of organizing principle for each of these disorders. So again, they argue that we can't just keep going forward to this kind of atomistic approach where we just have a set of criteria, a set of symptoms, without any accounts of how these symptoms are brought together or what links them together. So not only should we try to understand how it is that the symptoms are organized or how they're linked together, how they interact, but a lot of phenomenologists also suggest that for each disorder, we can typically identify what they call a core gestalt. So some kind of core alteration or core disturbance, that's the central one. And if we identify what that one is, we'll find that all of the other symptoms tend to kind of orbit around this one alteration. In some cases, that might be caused by that alteration. In other cases, they might be things that we do in order to compensate for that alteration. But in general, I think that if we really want to understand a disorder, we don't just want to understand and kind of mark off every possible symptom we can find that sometimes occurs in that disorder. Instead, there's often one kind of fundamental experiential alteration that we should aim to identify and describe. And then finally, they also aim for an approach that's more open to revision. And what that means, I think, differs among phenomenologists. So in some cases, phenomenologists tend to think that the current categories that we use are generally the right categories, but that we haven't described the symptoms very well. And there are actually other symptoms like alterations in how one experiences time or their body in the case of depression that's not discussed in the DSM, that if we actually added those kinds of symptoms, we'd be in a better position to more accurately diagnose depression. So they might think that the categories we've drawn are mostly correct, but what we need to do is refine the symptoms. In other cases, they might argue that the categories themselves are correct. So some have argued that we need to probably subtype depression into at least, for instance, 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of disorders, because the category of depression as currently presented is far too heterogeneous. And then yet other phenomenologists might argue that we should maybe try moving away from categories entirely, and instead we can use dimensional approaches. And this is also used outside of phenomenology. There's other psychiatrists who have pushed for a more dimensional approach, but at least a phenomenological version of this would say something like, well, instead of using categories like depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, we might instead say, well, let's look at the wide variety of ways in which your experience of time can alter, or the variety of ways in which your affective experience can alter, or experience of your body can alter. And we can start articulating these in more kind of dimensional ways rather than just drawing these discrete categories. So there's a lot more to say about all of this, about issues, the psychiatric classification, and what it is that phenomenology might provide. I think I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. Wonderful. If any of you wants to ask a question, please feel free to jump in. Everything, yeah, I think it's the DSM, how we got there, what are we using actually, and how phenomenology can implement it. So if you want to ask questions, just use the chat box or jump in. Do you, meanwhile, while we're reading, I ask mine, do you think we are going to get, somebody's going to write down a manual that uses phenomenology for psychiatric disorders? Is it in the horizon, as far as you know, you are more in the field than I am? Or
no, not in any kind of strong sense, but I think at least some of the work that's done in, I mean, the main disorder that phenomenologists have studied is schizophrenia. And some of that work, I believe, is kind of trickling into mainstream psychiatry. So for instance, the need to focus on the sense of self and how aspects of selfhood have altered. Some of that seems to have made its way into diagnostic manuals. I think some of it has made its way into the International Classification of Diseases, even if it hasn't made its way into the DSM. So there's some way, right? So in this case, that's not quite what the phenomenologists are going for. They'd prefer a kind of a major overhaul of the general approach being used. But what we've got so far is that the approach stays the same, but sometimes there are cases where the phenomenological research might play a role in slightly modifying what's gone on. But I think that's fairly typical. I don't think there's any real research program that ever just kind of fundamentally overhauls except for that one example of the Feigner Criteria, kind of shifting us from DSM-2 to 3, but that's quite unusual for such a major shift. In most cases, there's a variety of research that chips away on little bits and makes minor modifications. But because there's so much kind of widespread dissatisfaction with the DSM, I wouldn't be surprised if there was another total shift in the approach. But in general, the way most psychiatrists lean on this, I think, is toward the neurobiological side rather than toward the experiential side.
Completely, yeah. Where do you see the overlap between the phenomenological approach and operationalism? Because you emphasize mostly the differences.
Yeah. Well, one point of overlap, I guess, is this focus on signs and symptoms. So, for instance, if you were contrasting an operational approach with like a purely neurobiological approach, the operational approach is looking for things that we can easily observe in a clinical encounter, and the neurobiological approach would be looking for something that probably can't be observed at all in a clinical encounter. You need some kind of testing in order to identify these alterations. Whereas phenomenology, at least on the experiential side, it's still interested in looking for instance, alterations or disturbances in one's experience that a patient might be able to easily report, at least if they're asked the right questions. So often the issue is that you're not really asking the right questions in the clinical encounter to get the patient to tell you about the aspects of their experience that are in fact important for conducting a diagnosis.
Right, makes sense. And do you think we can include, I mean, concepts like intersubjectivity, body, yeah, you spoke about it. Time, we incorporated in others, or anything according to the experience might work.
Sorry, you cut out there for a second. Were you asking if some
Oh,
of
I'm
the other
sorry.
phenomenological concepts could be incorporated
Yeah,
into?
do you think there are there certain phenomenological concepts that are more useful in psychiatry than others, or
Yeah, so I mean, I think most of the core concepts have been used to some degree within psychiatry already, but the ones that have seem to have been most useful are concepts of temporality. So a lot of phenomenological psychiatrists argue that we can distinguish among different kinds of disorders because each disorder will involve its own kind of orientation toward time. And I think that comes from phenomenologists, even in Husserl and Heidegger, for instance, arguing that temporality is the most fundamental structure of experience. So if you adopt that view, then you'll also assume that in order to understand the differences between disorders, temporality is going to be the most important. But I think in terms of the ones that have actually had the most of an effect on the broader literature right now, selfhood, definitely in the study of schizophrenia, and probably embodiments in the case of depression, although there is also quite a big focus on alterations in the experience of time in depression as well.
Thank you. We finally have one question from the audience. I don't know if you want to read it aloud.
Yeah, I can read it out loud.
Yeah.
I have a question about the core disturbance and its possible use in classificatory approaches. Let us assume that phenomenologists identify the core disturbance of schizophrenia. Given the understanding that core disturbance is the kind of experiential alteration that gives meaning to and articulates the relationship between various features of a target disorder, should we say that phenomenologists are in some way committed to categorical approach as opposed to dimensional one? That's a really good question, and I think that if you're looking for this kind of core disturbance, then it does seem to naturally lend itself to this kind of categorical approach. But I don't think it's necessarily opposed to a more dimensional approach. It may very well be the case that you can identify multiple dimensions along which experience is going to alter. And there may be a lot of room for interpretive debate about which of those dimensions is the most fundamental. But there may also be ways to identify which one's most fundamental, or identify that there is none that's kind of more fundamental than the others, for instance. And I think also, just thinking in more practical terms, it does seem like dimensional approaches may be very useful for research purposes, but they're going to probably be kind of too resource intensive and time intensive to use in clinical practice. Right? There's something that's much kind of quicker about identifying someone using a category, and then just knowing that if you've categorized someone in a particular way, then you have a certain kind of set of treatment and interventions and stuff that you can use. So in that respect, I think that even if we were to use a more dimensional approach, it might be the case that we'd use that for research, but that once we need to integrate this back into clinical practice, we may still fall back into categories. And it may be the case that this kind of core gestalt can be quite useful in deciding how we want to draw the boundaries between those categories.
Hi. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. So thanks for the answer. Can you hear me well? The reason why I just typed up the answer is because it just breaks off all the time. So I decided to just type it up. I hope it doesn't break off. Yeah, thanks for the answer. So, but like one of the reasons why I'm really interested in that question about the core disturbance and then the classificatory approach is that recently I came across the the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, and then when I read their proposal, I was just like, oh my God, this is the way to go. I felt that was like the way to solve the comorbidity problem and also the heterogeneity problem, also while retaining the kind of, trying to identify something like a homogeneity within the various types of disorder, and they have their own like higher taxa. And I was thinking, and I studied schizophrenia, and I was thinking that, like the minimal self-disturbance model, ipseity disturbance model, that can maybe function as like a high top in a way. So I was thinking that maybe this minimal self-disturbance could be as like taken as a higher order disturbance, whereas the symptoms that we see in the case of schizophrenia, like a primary delusion or the thought insertions, can be like put it into the lower level, like the yeah. And I was thinking, and on top of that, I was thinking maybe this minimal self like concept can function as like I don't know, as an aspect of experience that can alter, not simply in the case of schizophrenia, but just across mental disorder. And if that kind of a research can be put forward, then we may be able to see that this minimal self-disturbance may not be particular to schizophrenia, but may be particular to bipolar. And if we can find something like that, it could directly feed into the current phenomenological psychopathological understanding of schizophrenia. So yeah, so my question was just more related with the kind of the ways to like make phenomenologically inspired dimensional approach, because I was blown off by the high top.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of space for phenomenologists to start looking at other alternative models, because they've spent a lot of their time critiquing the dominant approach, this operational approach and so on, and haven't spent that much time thinking about to what extent some of the new approaches that are being presented and developed now are actually ones that might in some respects be compatible. Right, so I've done work on how phenomenology might be compatible with new dimensional approaches, even though those approaches are typically presented as ones that are primarily focused on neurobiology and brain circuitry, but there's still space for phenomenology to contribute in some way. And then I've done some work on with some clinical psychologists and psychiatrists on how you can also use phenomenology potentially to be integrated with clinical staging models, but I haven't specifically written anything on high top, and I don't know if actually any phenomenologists have. I mean, I know of some phenomenological psychologists and psychiatrists who are quite familiar with those alternatives and approaches, but I don't know if any of them have really thought carefully about what role phenomenology might have in the development of those models and approaches.
Right. Yeah. That's the kind of sentiment that I felt, was that after just like coming across the high top, I like my go-to search was, sorry, I try to monopolize the Q&A, but the first thing that I did after like understanding this is what do phenomenologists say about this? And I think I only came across your paper, and that was written by, there was with respect to the clinical staging model. And yeah, so this is and then I went down to the dimensional approach, kind of like a rabbit hole, like, oh, maybe this like the whole existential like self-fluid temporality embodiment can function as the higher taxa, whereas the other stuff can be like function as the lower like symptom aggregated level. Sorry, sorry, it wasn't much of a question.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. Somehow it was in the back of my mind as well. And it's an interesting direction to explore as well. And once again, thank you so much for this great presentation. I hope, it's building a new path for, health, taking care of each other. So all my gratitude to your work, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation.
And if any of you have questions later on, maybe you can contact me, and I will pass the questions. And for now, I wish you a pleasant day wherever you are.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.